Nations aren't easy to define, but they're an important lens through which modern people view the world. And while the debate over who belongs precisely to which nation or where their borders fall may seem like trivial disputes, the stakes for these discussions often become incredibly high, and numerous conflicts in the 20th century are, at least in some sense, expressions of different conceptions of just what nations are and how they should operate. Moreover, nation-states, that is, political organizations that try to combine nationalistic identity with governmental autonomy, will come to dominate the world stage and become the most common type of government on Earth by the end of the Cold War. So to understand nation-states, let's try and start with some basic and uncontroversial definitions for both state and nation. When we think about states, we should think about independent governments that have sovereignty. They rule themselves. This is somewhat confusing for Americans, since by this definition of state, our states aren't really states anymore, and really haven't been since we adopted the Constitution in the 1780s. In fact, some U.S. states, especially our great state of Texas, seem like they might be a better fit with this definition of nations for finding common culture and heritage amongst a large group of people. So it should already be clear that the distinctions between a state and a nation, even with these very simple definitions, can get messy. Adding to our difficulties in modern parlance, it's common to use these two terms, as well as the even more ambiguous word country, interchangeably. But when you think about world history, and when you write for this class, if you stick to these definitions, you'll be able to write and to think with far more clarity than you would otherwise. But even these simple definitions raise some very complex questions about just how separate the ideas of nation and state are, and how they might independently operate. So it's worth asking a few questions about just what a stateless nation or a nationless state would look like. I don't know if there's ever been a completely nationless state. The very act of political organization probably entails at least some sense of cultural unity. But some former states, like the Ottomans, are sometimes called multinational empires. That is, they spread out over such a large amount of territory and controlled so many different people that they are forced to develop strategies to rule over many nations at once. One of the people controlled in the old Ottoman Empire was the Armenians, who had once maintained a long-standing and powerful state of their own. First established around 600 BCE, the Kingdom of Armenia had maintained its autonomy, and in 301 CE became the first state ever to adopt Christianity as its religion. While the kingdom was defeated in the 5th century, subsequent rulers in the area, such as the Byzantines and the various Arabic states, allowed the Armenians to maintain an autonomous province within their empires. However, by the early 15th century, the Armenians had mostly come under Ottoman control. But the early Ottoman multinational state valued the various ethnicities and religious minorities within their empire and allowed them to practice their own traditions so long as they paid a tax to the state. This wasn't a terrible situation for the Armenians. However, by the late 19th century, as we can see on this map, the Ottoman Empire was in steep decline. As the Ottomans lost much of their territory, strong nationalist tendencies emerged. Many people began to suggest that the Ottoman state should not be multinational at all, that this territory was designated only for those who were ethnically Turkish. Many earlier policies of tolerance were reversed, and minorities such as the Armenians were very much treated as second-class citizens, or as one British traveler remarked in the 1890s, as dogs and pigs. In response, Armenians tried to assert themselves by starting a nationalist liberation movement of their own. But this was met with repression by the Ottoman government, and between 200,000 and 300,000 Armenians were massacred between 1895 and 1900. During World War I, the Ottoman Empire supported the Central Powers, including Germany, Austria, and Italy, and like other states at this time, used the draft to ensure that they had enough soldiers. But this draft was also a way for the Ottoman government to begin the planned extermination of their Armenian population. As happened with the later Holocaust, the government also started arresting and imprisoning community elites, journalists, lawyers, and doctors who might have had ways to counteract or at least publicize this movement. Next, using the pretext that the Armenians were a threat to the government because of their rioting, Armenian civilians were rounded up and deported. These deportations often ended in one of two ways: the massacre of those being deported, or the death of those marching due to a lack of supplies. Of those who survived deportation, most found themselves in various concentration camps along the modern-day Turkish border with Syria and Iraq. This movement of Armenian peoples was witnessed by Europeans in the Ottoman Empire. German engineers in the empire, to help their allies the Ottomans build railroads and thus contribute to the war effort, recorded how they saw Armenians loaded onto rail cars like cattle. In 1918, a German major general remarked that there can hardly be any doubt that the Turks systematically are aiming at the extermination of the few 100,000 Armenians whom they left alive until now. News of the Armenian massacres reached an international audience. There were efforts in Europe and the United States to raise money to stop their extermination. However, it was not until after the war ended in 1919 that the Ottoman government halted the genocide. The 1920 treaty, which officially ended the war between the Ottoman Empire and the Allies, explicitly called for the Ottoman government to look for and punish those responsible for the genocide. Eventually, a few senior officials in the Ottoman government were tried for their roles in this event. Most historians believe that upwards of 500,000 Armenians lost their lives between 1914 and 1918. Most of the world would agree that this event qualifies as a genocide. In fact, when the crime of genocide was first devised in the 1930s, it was through the study of this particular event. However, in Turkey, it's still a crime to acknowledge that this event was a genocide at all. The Turkish government prefers to cast it as a kind of misunderstanding that occurred with enemy combatants without the organization of the modern Turkish government at all. As for the Armenian territory, after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, the new Soviet Union claimed it as theirs, and so Armenia was part of the USSR until 1991. Another people once under the control of the Ottoman Empire are the Kurds, who originate in the northern Middle East. Linguistically and culturally similar to people of Iranian or Persian descent, people known as Kurds have been identified in historical records since the 4th century CE. And yet, over the course of history, the Kurds were never a large enough proportion of the Middle Eastern population to maintain their own state. During the 9th and 10th centuries, many Kurds converted to Islam, as did most Middle Eastern peoples who lived under Islamic rule, and there were at times recognized Kurdish provinces throughout various Muslim states. Beginning in the 16th century, most of the Kurdish population was brought under Ottoman control, and they remained there until the breakup of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. Kurdish nationalism arose in the 1920s, and the Kurds attempted to establish autonomous states both within the new Republic of Turkey and within the Kingdom of Iraq. But both times these states were dissolved. In Turkey, the government tried to minimize Kurdish influence by encouraging people of other ethnicities to settle in traditionally Kurdish areas. In response, the Kurds would form a political party, the PKK, or Kurdistan Workers' Party. In Iraq, under first a king and then a president, the Kurds were offered some areas for self-rule, but these areas were not necessarily traditionally Kurdish. While the Kurds accounted for about 17% of Iraq's total population, they were routinely shut out of the political system. During the Iran-Iraq War, the Kurds essentially started a separate civil war in Iraq. In response, the Iraqi government under Saddam Hussein began a program of ethnic cleansing of the Kurds in 1986 that continued until about 1988. Estimates indicate that nearly 200,000 Kurds were killed during this time. One particularly brutal attack against the town of Halabja occurred in 1988. Poison gas was dropped over this town and about 5,000 Kurds were killed. In 1991, the Kurds attempted another rebellion against the Iraqi army, but were again oppressed. This time, many Kurds fled their villages in Iraq and headed either east to Iran or west into Turkey and Syria, which exacerbated the problems both of those countries were already having with their Kurdish populations. Both the Armenians in the late 19th century and the Kurds today can be classified as stateless people. In a diplomatic sense, to be considered stateless, one must not qualify for citizenship in the country in which they were born, or in the countries in which their parents may hold citizenship. This seems like an odd situation for native-born Americans, where we know that being born in the United States guarantees American citizenship thanks to the 14th Amendment. However, most countries in the Eastern Hemisphere do not grant citizenship in this way. As a result, sometimes children are born stateless. But statelessness can be about much more than simple citizenship. and sometimes even citizenship can carry far less than equal rights and privileges for ethnic minorities within a state. Instead, let's consider the communities of people who, in the aftermath of decolonization, when nation-states become the default political system throughout the world, were left without a nation-state of their own. For many of these stateless peoples, their struggle for recognition stretches for centuries or even millennia, and yet, as the world began acquiring its modern political borders, they were still left out. They were, in effect, a stateless nation. Probably the most famous attack on a stateless nation was against the European Jewish community during the late 1930s and early 1940s. The genocide against the Jews, as well as other undesirable populations, as described by the Nazi regime, is known as the Holocaust. Unlike the Kurds, the Jews did at one time have an independent state, although that kingdom of Israel had been dead since the time of the Roman empires. By the 20th century, Jews had experienced what is known as diaspora, when a people is spread far from their original location to many scattered places, while still retaining their ethnic identity as a minority group. However, their minority status provoked resentment across many European countries. The Nazi government of Germany, having attained power under an explicitly anti-Semitic platform, revoked Jewish citizenship in 1935, and then began to imprison the Jewish population under its control, eventually moving to exterminate this population beginning in 1941. This plan for extermination of Europe's Jews, called the Final Solution, was only halted in 1945 when the Nazis were defeated by the Allied forces. Between 11 and 12 million people were victims of the Holocaust, of which about 6 million were European Jews. It was the Holocaust which led the new United Nations to adopt the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. The Holocaust is recognized as genocide of the Jewish people because the Nazi regime attempted to exterminate as many of Europe's Jews as possible. While the promise to create a Jewish homeland had been made before the Holocaust, the victimization of Europe's Jews certainly paved the way for the UN to support the actual creation of a Jewish state, and in 1948, the State of Israel was established. Sadly, instances of ethnic cleansing have continued to occur in Europe. In the 1990s, tensions in the Balkans led to the Bosnian crisis. During the Cold War, this entire area was united as one state, Yugoslavia, which, although communist, had been open to diplomacy with the West. In the 1980s, Yugoslavia broke apart into various states, and broke apart along ethnic and religious lines. The majority of the population, Serbian Orthodox Christians, tried to maintain the most territory, and so targeted Bosnian and Kosovar Muslims in the 1990s. This time, the West, through NATO, intervened, but not before several massacres and atrocities, such as the use of rape to intimidate the population, had occurred. As you've already seen when we looked at decolonization in Africa, genocide engulfed the country of Rwanda in the mid-1990s as well. There, long-standing ethnic tensions and European interventionism led to the conflict. When the Europeans arrived in Central Africa, they found a variety of states in this area. Among them was a strong Tutsi kingdom that had enormous influence over other Tutsi and Hutu states. When first the Germans, then the Belgians took over, they essentially administered their colony through the Tutsi, who were the most politically powerful group, but were not the ethnic majority. As independence neared in the early 1960s, Hutus began asserting their power, and as a result, many Tutsis left Rwanda rather than remain and be oppressed. However, some of these refugees eventually formed an army, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, and invaded Rwanda, sparking a civil war in the 1980s. By the early 1990s, peace had returned and a Hutu president was elected. For a time, the violence between the Tutsi and Hutu declined, and it seemed that the crisis was over. But then the Hutu president of neighboring Burundi was assassinated, and in early 1994 the Rwandan Hutu president was also assassinated, though later an investigation would show that he was murdered by Hutu extremists, not Tutsis. As a result, extremist Hutus within the government began a propaganda campaign which planned the extermination of Rwanda's Tutsis and any Hutus who defended them. The government armed the Hutu, and so in April of 1994 the genocide began. It lasted for only 100 days, and yet within that time an estimated 500,000 to 1 million Rwandans were killed, as much as 20% of the total population. As the genocide was ongoing, the international community mostly just kept watch. Eventually, the UN sent in a peacekeeping force which helped to end the violence, although not before some foreign soldiers were killed. Anticipating a Tutsi retaliation, which never came, hundreds of thousands of Hutus fled Rwanda and entered neighboring countries, sparking a refugee crisis. In 1996, trials began for those who participated in the genocide. These are ongoing to this day. Since 2003, Rwanda has been a more peaceful country, with the government consciously attempting to mediate between both large ethnic groups. In addition to ethnic cleansing, another possible consequence of a world system of nation-states is terrorism. Terrorism is defined by most governments as the unlawful use of, or threatened use of, force or violence against individuals or property to coerce or intimidate governments or societies, often to achieve political, religious, or ideological objectives. Terrorism, then, is by its very definition a radical act. But for some stateless people, or those who view themselves as stateless, it can appear to be a rational strategy to attain greater autonomy. The PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party we discussed earlier, for example, sometimes used violence to achieve their aims. For that reason, the PKK was and is labeled a terrorist organization by Turkey and many international organizations, including NATO, the EU, and the UN. So for many non-state terrorist groups, they consider terrorism to be simply the waging of an asymmetric war against a state opponent. They feel horrific acts of violence against civilians can be justified in order to gain greater autonomy for their people. Another factor as a cause of terrorism is the rise of a globalized economy. In the 20th century, the increasing speed by which goods and ideas could be transferred between continents led many peoples to feel their culture had become marginalized, and many terrorist acts, especially in the Middle East, are often framed by their perpetrators as striking back against Western culture and preserving their way of life. And across the world, there are many groups, not just terrorist organizations, that object to globalization. While globalization creates more wealth generally, that wealth is far from evenly distributed. Wealthy countries and the wealthiest people in those wealthy countries will claim the largest gains, while some countries, peoples, and individuals will be left out. A globalized economy, which is by definition unrestricted, will do little to prevent either massive wealth accumulation or devastating poverty. And this globalized economy, especially in the wake of neoliberal reforms following the Cold War, asks really important questions about the nation state in general. In a world where capital, goods, and sometimes labor moves freely across national borders, do those borders retain any relevance? Under the European Union, two different states share the same currency, have no trade or travel restrictions, and largely share the same economic fate. In that circumstance, maybe it doesn't matter if they're different nationalities. And while not all states are as closely linked as members of the EU, our modern economy has become so globalized that we do generally share a deep economic interdependence. Very few goods are conceived, designed, manufactured, and sold all within a single country. As nation states engage in what amounts to a global division of labor, it becomes impossible for any of us to operate in isolation. Even when countries engage in protectionism and trade wars today, it's understood to be for strategic reasons, and that both sides are likely to be harmed, at least in the short term. The implications of these arrangements are not simply economic. Consumerism, the tendency of people in modern societies to be preoccupied with the acquisition of consumer goods, has become a deeply rooted portion of our culture. Indeed, modern people often define their own identity by virtue of the goods they purchase and the property they own. Brand names have become an incredibly powerful means of self-identification and can carry deep cultural meaning for those who purchase the associated products. The multinational corporations that own those brands grow immensely powerful in their ability to affect events on a global stage, and may even rival some nation states. Today, Apple is worth over $750 billion, and Alphabet, Google's parent company, is worth around $600 billion. It's not hard to find examples of these multinational corporations having significant effects on the sovereignty and autonomy of nation states, even without taking direct action like the United Fruit Company did in Guatemala. It's the nature of history to always experience a strong mix of forces. While the conflict between nationalism and globalism may cause science fiction authors to envision a 21st century of either vicious nationalist states perpetrating new acts of terrible violence in the name of ethnic purity, or greedy technological corpocracies where humanity becomes deeply commodified, the reality is we don't know what the future holds or what new ideas will take hold of humanity as time moves forward.